and existing without the participation of the Jewish people. Lodz had about 500 places of prayer. We had Jewish hospitals. We had Jewish schools, Jewish universities. Everything that a community needs, we had institutions, welfare institutions for those who actually were not supported by the government. We had our self-government, benevolent institutions that did immensely for the people. Religious life was a part of the city. And Lodz, when the Germans came in, my father had to leave Lodz. Lodz became annexed, a part of Germany. The name of the city was changed completely. All the remnants of Polish existence was completely erased. The names of the streets were completely changed. The name of the city became Litzmannstadt after the general who conquered Lodz. And persecution began by taking Jews to labor or taking out Jews and killing them in a smaller way, meaning they used to come into a restaurant and took 10 Jews and they disappeared. We didn't know where they were. Actually, later we found out what happened, what was their lot. And the persecution began with ordering all the Jewish people to be contained in a ghetto. The place where the ghetto was located was the poorest and the slummy area of Lodz. While this transformation from the city, from the most beautiful parts of the city, to this ghetto took place, many were shot. Many didn't want to leave their homes. Many committed suicide. But finally, in 1940, in May, the ghetto was closed, and we didn't have any connection whatsoever with the outside world.
And I worked on assembly line 10 to 12 hours a day, assembling bicycle wheels. It was like, every 6 minutes a wheel. When I didn't make the wheel, the whole assembly stopped. And I worked for a year, and then the workers decided to go on strike. Because they worked for such a pittance. So as I was underage, they kicked me out, throw me out. And they went on strike, and they used the type of strike they call Italian strike, which they sit in the factory, they don't move, So the boss said, I'm going to starve him out. So he put a lock, police around it, and closed the water, electricity, and tried to starve him out. 1 month later, the Germans came in. See, that, I don't know how they say you have a lock and a bad luck, you see. My bad luck came first, but that was the luck that I survived. And my parents being killed right there. They just, they pushed my father from the 5th floor. And my mother and my sister, one sister was killed, and they bombed the city 19 years ago. For burial, they buried them. They have lots of sand pits there in our town. They buried the bodies, and then they couldn't dispose of the bodies so fast. They used to cremate the bodies, and they extract bones and make soap from the people, and from bones they used to make bone meal for fertilizer. I was in Russia 2 years in a prison camp, then I was 4 years in the Russian army. They took me to the army, and then when we came west, when I took part of liberating Poland and Germany, till 1946. 1946 I was demobilized, and I just went home, and I saw there was nothing to come. They didn't destroy the town. The apartment was there. Even the pictures where my mother and my father used to have it on the walls with their pictures with they married. only the frames left, and they put pictures of Lenin and Stalin, and, you know. And the furniture was still everything standing, but they wouldn't let me in into the apartment because they were scared that maybe I going to ask everything back. But I looked on it, and I saw what became of the city, and I just turned back. I went back to Poland. From Poland, I got married at that time, my wife, and we escaped to Czechoslovakia through the mountains to Czechoslovakia. From Czechoslovakia, we went to Austria. There was to Russian zone, then to American zone. From Austria, we escaped to Germany, to American zone, and from Germany, we went to France, and from France, I came to Canada. And I said, that's it. I don't want to wander anymore. You know, since 1939 to 1949, I never slept in a bed. I always was on a move. Always on this. When I came here, you can live like a free man. You can work. You can go to a church. You can go to a synagogue. Nobody bothers you. You can go to school. I said, that's paradise. And I'm happy here. I don't want nothing else. Because you know, when a man is in the bottom, there's only one way to go, up. And I'm happy, and see lots of you, they're complaining. But they complain, they don't know what they're complaining about. See, in a country like Canada, was the best country in the world.
My grandfather and our whole family were great Hungarian patriots. For example, we never spoke Yiddish at home, and we didn't even know that that language existed. We were brought up as staunch, very, very patriotic Hungarians. My father was an officer during the First World War in the Hungarian army, and he was wounded, and every time there was a parade in town, my father was marching right in the forefront of it. Very handsome man with a big mustache and a lot of decorations. Proud Hungarians all. For a while, my family thought that we would be exempted somehow from all the horror. Really, when our relatives began to come from Germany and Austria, fleeing the Nazis, they told us what was to come. And then people came from Poland who saw concentration camps, who saw, or at least heard of gas chambers, and they came to Hungary and they told us to go, to leave. My grandfather wouldn't hear of it because he was a Hungarian and his whole family was a Hungarian, and nobody would do anything to him or to his children or to his grandchildren. They simply could not believe that what was to happen will happen. They somehow refused to see, which was obvious to everyone. And indeed, when you have lived in a place for, I guess, hundreds of years, you couldn't really imagine that suddenly your neighbors and everybody around you will turn against you and murder you. And that's exactly what happened, more or less. It was tremendous upheaval, as you can imagine.
The German government has appointed a man by the name Rumkowski. You have him here constantly signed, here, Rumkowski. He was a man, an old man, a naive man. I'm not condemning him. And they appointed him because he was, he had a patriarchal outlook, The Germans were not interested in finding a good leader. They needed actually a leader who is not a leader. But he found favor in their eyes because of his appearance. And maybe he had Jewish features, I don't know what their idea was. And they have appointed him to organize the Jewish community, to be responsible. Instead of dealing with the Jewish people directly, it should go through him. In spite of conditions, inhuman conditions that cannot be expressed properly in any language, the Jewish people did their best. I think this is the most heroic part in Jewish life, to maintain and to preserve the image of a human being. In spite of starvation, thousands of people die daily. We try to continue and to maintain our cultural and our moral life as high as possible. We had schools certainly without the permission of the Germans. It was in conspiracy. We have acknowledged the Saturday day, the day of rest. We have organized a Jewish press to inform the people about life, how to protect themselves and how to overcome it, and how to maintain the image of God placed upon humanity, and how to be full of hope. We try to look like people, like human beings, and to act like human beings. We never saw in our life, in this period of time, I mean, an apple, a lemon. There were children who were born in ghetto, they never saw in their life, they didn't know what an egg is. They didn't know what for instance, a glass of milk is. But we tried and we did our best to organize our life in a way that it will last. And religious life, constantly brought up as a means of being able to endure and to come over all these difficulties. They give us the right to have money, our own money, with the Star of David. The Star of David actually didn't mean in those days what it means today. In those days when we saw the Star of David, this had to be, actually had to carry it on our jacket and our coat as an identification that we are a Jew. When we saw that the Star of David, this was the odium of shame or the symbol of death. Thank God today the Star of David is a symbol of life.
The Germans came in and ran over Hungary, officially occupying it then, and then all the ultra-rightist elements who were still somehow kept in check before this occupation took over the government, and all the laws that were in effect in Germany against the Jews were now brought into effect in Hungary too. There were no news coming in from anywhere. The rumors were, that people were taken to Auschwitz, which turned out to be true. I didn't know it then, but after the war I did find out that my mother and my brother and all our family were gassed and then burned in the ovens in Auschwitz. My father, who was taken away to Germany, survived all the way through the war, and during the last day, in the course of a forced march, he couldn't walk any longer, and they shot him by the wayside, and that was it. My whole family went like that. So being in the ghetto at the time, I had some kind of vague, unbelievable hope, being 14 years old at the time, that the war will be over and I will get the train and I will go home and there will be my mother and my father and my brother and the whole family, and they will be sitting under the trees as they did in the summertime, and we will sit down and have dinner, and I will go to sleep in my bed. Well, that never came. We were hoping that we won't all die or starve, but the hope really was not nurtured by anything real. It was a miracle that we did survive, that I survived at any rate. My grandfather starved to death at the end of the siege. There was just no food, and in a kind of a delirium, he kept saying, if you could just get me a piece of white bread. That's all he wanted. He prayed every morning. He got up at 6 o'clock in the morning in the crowded place with people lying on the floor and on chairs and beds and huddled up, and he put on his prayer shawl and he prayed every morning. The Russians came and they liberated the city. The Germans went away, and we then could go back and pick up whatever pieces there were left. I think I went through a period that now I can only describe as a severe nervous breakdown, where I couldn't really function anymore. I tried to take care of my grandfather for a while, but it was just impossible. There was still no food, there was still nothing to be done. And one of my uncles turned up, and I just left my grandfather and I just went. And I got on top of the train, and I traveled to southern Hungary, where conditions were better at that time, and spent some time there. Then started to walk on foot back towards my birthplace, nurtured by this really insane kind of hope, which was now kind of insane because I knew that nobody was going to come back, that I will find my mother and my father and everybody home, and there will be. So I walked miles and miles for weeks, following the Russians who were chasing the Germans out, and sleeping in the fields and sleeping in barns and villages and so on.
I'm not bitter. I don't say that that we should forget, we should never forget. I cannot say if we should forgive. How can I dictate to someone to forgive for something that he has lost? I can forgive the things that belong to me and someone took it away from me. Then I can say to myself, forgive. But I am in no position to say to somebody else, forgive. Forgive for the death of your father, or for the death of your brother, or a relative. If the world would have not have been indifferent, we didn't expect any help. We expected that our neighbors should not collaborate with our enemies. And if our neighbors would not have collaborated with our enemies, I am convinced that we would have had saved possibly 2 million Jews. Because the Germans, how organized they were in no position to detect all the Jews that lived in Europe. They had the help of the people, of the non-Jewish people living in Europe. It is true that many, many non-Jewish people showed great, great humanitarian generosity by helping and saving the lives of Jews, because we know that by saving the lives of a Jew it meant actually death penalty. But they are only a few, and those who did it certainly are inscribed in golden letters and will be inscribed in the annals of Jewish life. We have in Israel a special institution which is called Yad Vashem, and everyone who helped Jews, he receives a special medal and some kind of remuneration and gratitude forever. For instance, the Danish people will never be forgotten from the history of the Jewish people. It will be a part of our life and of our history. But on the other hand, I say that those good people that helped us, they indirectly accused those who didn't help us.
You could hear the guns, and you can hear the cannons, and you could hear the bombing as the Russians were pursuing the Germans. It was a lovely spring day. I was walking along the canal that has its mouth at the lake where my town was. And I remember the tall grasses and the weeds. It was a lovely, lovely day. And this kind of a delusion really was becoming more and concrete in my mind, really feeling that another hour and I'll be home, the same home that I had before. And I was walking along the canal from the other side. I remember somebody shouting across it, "Jew, you have come home, hey?" And I was only, 15 years old, a very scrawny and thin, miserable kind of a 15-year-old. And I just ran from then on. I ran like somebody was crazed. until I got to our house. It had big iron gates leading into the courtyard, this very big courtyard. And the name of my father was still on the storefront, and the windows were all broken. And I walked into the courtyard, and the whole courtyard was covered with furniture, mountains and mountains of furniture, because our house, being the biggest one in town, having the biggest courtyard, was used as a kind of storage place for all the furniture of the Jews. And there were mountains of this furniture. I could hardly get into our house. You know, I could hardly get into through the door, but I did. And again, there was furniture, and in my parents' bedroom, there was again a mountain of books. All our books were dumped. We had a very big library, and all the books that I read as a child were piled in the middle of the floor, soggy because the rain came in, and practically reaching up to the ceiling. And I remember walking into my parents' bedroom, where I slept as a small child too, and sitting on this top of these books and just crying for, I think, must have been for 24 hours, just sitting there. Well, some sort of normalcy was restored in Hungary. I went to live with an aunt and an uncle of mine. I tried to go back to school, but there is no use. I was young and totally disturbed, dislocated. And I was doing things, you know, that were not really acceptable to a home. I was very wild. And at the first opportunity I left Hungary, wanting to go to Israel at the time, so I was in Germany for quite a while, living in a former concentration camp, which was now a gathering place for orphans. Then suddenly I wanted to do something. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to read again. I wanted to have some kind of a more regular life. I thought of going back to Hungary, but I was discouraged from that by people who were back in Hungary and came back to Paris. So every week I would go to a different embassy and ask whether they can use a 16-year-old Hungarian Jewish orphan. And I put down my name in all the lists that one had to put down one's name. And every time you applied for a visa to a country, you had to undergo a medical examination, and they always took your blood. And when you are starving, you know, you can't really afford that pint or whatever that they take from you. So I had to, you know, time these visits to the embassies pretty judiciously, because you could keel over after you visit 2 in 1 week. The Canadian Jewish Congress then sent people to Europe, and they were looking for orphans, Jewish orphans, who could be brought to Canada. I came to Canada under the scheme of the Canadian Jewish Congress, and I came here in 1947, in the fall of 1947. I didn't know where Winnipeg was or what Winnipeg was. I asked for a map of Canada, and Winnipeg being in the middle of it and having been involved in so many extreme situations, just the mere fact that Winnipeg was in the middle of the continent, I pointed to Winnipeg, and I said, that's where I want to go, it looks safe. And this is how I got to Winnipeg. And I came here with a group of boys. One of them was my kind of adopted brother, David Ehrlich, who is now in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. And David and I were placed at in the home of the Shacks, Sybil Shack and Mrs. Shack, and Mr. Shack, who died a few years after we arrived there. They were the most exceptional people I have ever come across in my life. I didn't know it then. I could feel it, and it was everything in the air. But now, 25 years later, I realized that I was placed in the home of exceptional, extraordinary human beings. I feel myself very Jewish because my whole life has been shaped and formed very strongly by the fact that I was born a Jew. It's not the only influence, shaping influence in my life, but a very important one, obviously. Because I don't think I could have borne the negative factors of my Jewishness if I wouldn't have had already some very positive factors. And those things came from my Jewishness. The whole idea of suffering is very much part of Jewishness. The idea of life must be lived here and now, not in another world and not after death, is also very Jewish in my life. My sense of social responsibility, that I am here not only for myself, what I can do for myself, but what I can do for others, is a very strongly Jewish strain in me. The whole thing about starting theaters and involving myself in community affairs, which I've done all my life, is part of my Jewishness. I'm also very enriched, and have been enriched by Jewish traditions. I do a great deal of reading in Jewish mysticism, for example. I'm very concerned and interested in Jewish religion. Not because I'm a practicing Jew, but because it's part of my tradition. Some of the things that young people are talking about today, ways of life, ways of perceiving reality, ways of interpreting reality, can also be found in Judaism. And I'm rediscovering those things now, and I'm very excited about those things. The whole experience that I had in Winnipeg, in Canada, with the Canadian Jewish Congress, and more specifically with the shacks, reconfirmed my faith in the positive aspect of Judaism, which is of service, fellowship, a bond, caring and loving for fellow human beings, is very important to me. I also feel that being part of a group of people who survived for 5,000 or 6,000 years is nothing to be scoffed at. And I don't say that Jew is beautiful the same way as you say black is beautiful or black is proud, or I don't go that far in a kind of chauvinistic direction, but nevertheless in a quiet humanistic way, I am fortunate, that I have been born a Jew. I can't imagine myself to be anything else. Not because of the specific ritualistic elements of it, but because of a Jew's outlook on life, because the way a Jew looks at society, because the way a Jew looks at another human being. And that way I am very proud.